Right, so hello and welcome. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions. We've got Chris here with us, we're in Nottingham, and Paul Browning in the background, who is our host and our technical support. Sadly Dylan can't be with us, but he has very kindly answered a lot of the questions for us, and Paul is going to intercut those with the responses that Chris is going to give. So Dylan's on a flight, so I hope he has a good trip, and we will start going through the questions that you've sent us, so thank you very much. So question number 1, Chris, is from Faith Warren, who is asking about differentiating for learning and about the methods that seem to work with smaller well-behaved groups, and whether or not these would work or other strategies you might put in place for less receptive students.
Well, I mean, it's always a difficult one. You know, we want our students to work with us to move their learning forward, but sometimes it's a matter of just starting off slowly, getting your students moving with a few of the ideas, then gradually building on that as they start to respond better. Because like any students in the classroom, as they start to gain confidence in what they're doing, then the sort of disruptive behaviour tends to decline a little. You just have to use your best teaching skills, which I'm sure you can, Faith.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Okay, our next question from Emma. She's talking she's writing and saying that obviously we've used a lot of different strategies on the course, and she recognises that there are a number of different approaches that she can use. Her question is about what happens in reality. Do we see all of them working alongside each other, or whether we would focus on just one? Her gut feeling, she says, is that focusing on one is more beneficial to allow students to build up that learning and reflective vocab mastery and learning behaviours.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Emma. I mean, I think any new strategy you try is going to take a little while for your students to get used to, but also for you to realise its potential and the best way to really support those learners when you're doing PACE or, you know, whatever strategy you've actually picked up. So try one, see how it was, a particular group. Try it maybe with another group and see, you know, how that differs or is similar. And then take the best from it and push forward, and then gradually layer the other ones on top as you need them.
Okay, so there you go, Emma, some wise advice there about being persistent and resilient. Moving on to a question from Maria Noah Lazzo. She says she loved the idea of the PACE Quadrant, it caught her eye, but she did notice that in the classroom that we exemplified it, which was our Sarah McNally's classroom, that there was actually one teacher and 3 teaching assistants in the classroom who were each working with a different group. She says that where she works, she doesn't have teaching assistants. How could she, as a single teacher, cope with this kind of lesson? What are your thoughts, Chris?
Well, I've seen it done in classrooms where there aren't teaching assistants, and the teachers manage that quite well. But then again, it's one where the teacher was quite well practiced in using it, so knew her students well, knew the strategy, and knew when support was needed and when it wasn't. I think it is worth trying, because what it does, as you start to use it more, is your students can take over making the decisions about which ones of the quadrants that they will do, and they start to learn how they should go about it. So again, it's like the last one, it's practice, trying to get things better, and persisting with it really until it starts to work well. But you're saying about somebody's done race rather than PACE.
Yeah, so somebody, I'm sorry I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was somebody in the comment threads on the course, which is another way to advertise the richness that is there that is additional to what we've planned for you. Somebody was recommending or thinking that they could have a go at doing race, which was recall, apply, correct and extend, rather than our practice, apply, correct and extend. So actually, and this is what I love about teachers, is that they're creative, so we get an idea, and then teachers are thinking about how they can take that and adapt it for their students.
Yeah, and it might be with one of the STEM subjects that race is better, and maybe with another, maybe maths, PACE is better. So
yeah,
it's finding what goes with your subject area as well.
Yeah, so I hope that helps. So thank you very much for your question there, Maria. So moving on, our next question is from Nicola Crawford, and Nicola is asking particularly about Hinge Questions. So we had some Hinge Questions as part of our diagnostic week, so as an idea there. She was asking, can we share, so this is you Chris, can you share your thoughts on which of the questions you think are suitable as Hinge Questions and why? Because she's someone who's new to it and would appreciate some advice before she gets the rest of her team involved.
Okay, so Hinge point questions are really difficult to craft. So some of the ones we've seen have made a good start, but need some work on them. And it's one of the things that we're thinking of doing some work on over the next few months. But find a hinge point question that seems you and your colleagues think will work, and then just try it out in the classroom. That's the final test for it. What is important is when you have tried it out, to then monitor what happens afterwards to see whether or not that hinge point question really did do what you'd hoped it would do, and really does direct your learners to an appropriate task afterwards. And really just take forward those students that maybe you were worried about, were a little bit unsure whether they've got it or not. Has the actual action done that? And then use that information next time as well to guide you.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. So thank you, Nicola, for that question. Also, Nicola, I don't know if you're aware, or if anybody else who wants to explore further hinge questions, that the sister course that we run, Assessment for Learning in STEM Teaching, focuses very much on dialogue in the classroom and when to ask particular questions for a particular purpose. And one of those questions that we look at is hinge questions, and there's a lot more detail on that. There'll be another iteration of that course, and if you Google Future Learn at AFL, you'll be able to pick up when the next version of it will be running. So if you want to do that,
31st of October.
31st of October.
31st of October.
So if you want to do that, and get your team involved doing it, that'd be a really good way for all of you to develop your practice. And as Chris says, reflect on how they go in practice in the classroom. So I would highly recommend that for you and your team. So thank you very much. Okay, moving on to Carol Holden. So again, a similar question here. She appreciates how the differentiation will help the students, particularly those who are out of their depth to cope long term, but her question is how she manages the variety of tasks when she's got no TAs and some of her students have got entrenched behavioural problems, and also she says that the school she works in is not nearly as resourced as those shown here. So any guidance about making that transition? I think you've already mentioned a couple of things about practising with one idea.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the other thing is, sometimes you have to think pragmatically and think how many different ways do I need to differentiate. Maybe you just need to sort of just do two different ways and split the class into two. Not necessarily saying half and half. It might be that 20% of them move on to one thing and the other 8% do a particular thing, and then you take that and think about how are they doing. As the 20% get on, maybe you then can work with your 80% and divide them up a little bit and give them different types of support to get them through. So it's really finding ways that work for you and simplifying things if you have got classes that are not settling down to the work, or if you are a bit light on resources, as you seem to suggest. Yeah, so tailor it to your own context, really, is what I think is best for all.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. So that's something that I think that's coming out again. We're getting some themes coming out from the responses and the ideas. So thank you very much, Carol. Our next question, Chris, is from Sheila Dagger. Nagarajan. Apologies if I pronounce people's names wrong. I do apologise. Sheila's question is, she's talking about, and this is about student motivation really, which was one of our principles in our first week. What do you do if the child wants to do the less challenging task? How does the teacher deal with this action? And how will you be scaffolding the child's learning?
I think sometimes just let them do it. I mean, it depends really on your relationship with that child and what they've been like before. But, start them off on the tasks that they think. And as you see that they're speeding along with it, or maybe, they're not settling down to work, that's your cue to go in and say, is this really right for you? How about trying this one? And encourage them to have a go at it. Sometimes it's just fear of trying something that they might fail at. But really that's what we want them to go for. We don't want them to go for all the things they can easily do. We want them to occasionally go for challenges, because that's how they learn. So finding that sort of way in where you can have an interaction with them that doesn't stop the rest of the class learning. So let them make a start, step in when it's the appropriate time. That's when the intervention is needed to move them forward. And then next time, just put the one you want them to do in front of them, and they'll probably just get on with it. They are quite willing, most kids are, to fit in with what you want, as long as they don't get shown up in front of their peers, and that's what's the fear for most learners.
Yeah, absolutely. So there you go, some great advice there. Thank you very much for that question. So, moving on to Bella Wartovo, who's asked a few questions. I know that Dylan's answered a couple of these, Bella. So the one for you, Chris, is learners are unique.
Yeah.
What would be the best unified formative approach that will help minimise time constraints and curriculum deadlines while gathering learning evidence? And I know that Dylan answered a couple of questions on this, which I think is people being worried that they have to get through so much curriculum with the deadline of an exam or whatever at the end. So what's your thoughts, Chris?
Well, one thing I can promise you is that if you get your assessment for learning, you get differentiation right, then the kids start doing a lot of learning for themselves, and that means that they can tackle the curriculum with you rather than you feeling you've got to drag them through the curriculum. So it does get better the more you get into these sorts of approaches. I think the thing to do really is to find some good questions, whether they're hinge point questions or whether they're just good questions that get kids talking. Because that diagnosis of their needs early on is absolutely key. If you get that right, then the responsive teaching that you do through differentiation is going to be that much more effective. And that's going to save you time in the long run and help you get through the curriculum more effectively and more confidently. And that's particularly important, both for you to feel that you can move on with the students with their learning, but also the students feel that they're with you rather than being dragged along to speed they can't cope with. So good questions are really key to this.
Absolutely, thank you. Something else as well, Bella, because I've read Chris and Dylan have done work previously where they've talked about as well, what are the key ideas of your curriculum? What are the building blocks and the foundations the students have to know, and really making sure that you drive home those and that they understand those, and that some other things actually they may be beneficial, but actually not the foundations that they need. So it's the stuff that you teach as well that you're assessing is really important too.
Yeah.
Okay, so I hope that helps. So Sana Zulkarnain wants to know how a curriculum, again, she or he are asking, they're asking about book free and time bound, but the question I thought we'd pick up on is, do you need to differentiate every time, or can we just use it alternatively?
I wouldn't try and sort of fit it into a pattern. I mean, I think it's just seeing whether something's appropriate. I mean, there are times when maybe the students can access things at a similar rate together on a few bits. And then when you start to question them about what understanding they've got, that's when you find out whether you need to scaffold or not their learning and help them move forward with their ideas. So possibly while they're getting the information for those emerging ideas, then no, you don't need to differentiate. But once you're starting to question and find out what those emerging ideas are, that's when you start differentiating. Then students can move at the rate they need to so that they can all learn and they can all reach their full potential.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Sarah. It's the fact that you can't differentiate until you've done something first. So it's not that presumption, it's that eliciting evidence and then actually doing some differentiating as a consequence of what you find out. So that's really useful, so thank you for that, Sana. We have a question from Diane Walsh. The bit that I'm going to ask you to think about, Chris, because we've looked at how regularly would you recommend, I think you've already answered that. It's about planning. So she says she spends a fair amount of her weekends planning lessons now, and as good as some of these strategies sound, she wonders how she can manage the planning of those and have a work-life balance, I think is what she's asking.
I need advice on that myself, actually. I'm not very good at that side of it. But I think possibly one of the things that you need to do is to plan in a general way the main steps that you're going to take during that week with your learners. And then the focus should be just on refining those as you're collecting evidence from your learners as to which ones you need to focus on and strengthen and which other ones can you just sort of either let slip a bit or maybe can put off for another week. So it's just finding regular time to do it, but only short bursts of time to do the planning and not to do, which I see many of the young teachers that I work with on teacher training do, which is spend hours searching on the internet for things. Find your resources from other colleagues who've probably got a lot either on the computer or in the cupboards in the classrooms. And then think about the best way to use them. That's what you should spend your time planning, how to use resources effectively and not spending a lot of time searching for resources.
So great advice. So it's the use of them and not necessarily the resource. So I hope that helps, Diane. Thank you. Our next question is from Warren McIntyre. Warren asks, in a group activity, how do you stop one or more members doing nothing and just riding the wave of the others' work?
I think you have to really check whether they are doing nothing or are they just listening. Not all learners, when they participate, actually actively say things. We would all like them to because we want to know what's inside their heads. But you do get some students, both weak and strong students, who are thinking, listening and thinking and working out their ideas. So what I would tend to do is, as I was going around and noticing that a couple of times, maybe just occasionally sort of asking a particular student, what did they think of what the previous student has said, or can you add to what somebody has said? Those sorts of subsidiary questions that we use all the time in an assessment for learning classroom, because that's what will actually help you to know that they actually are keeping up with the learning that's going on. And if they are sort of falling asleep, it just gives them that jolt to move them forwards. You see teachers using that a lot in the classroom. But then, they can join in with the differentiated approach, even if they're not actively talking in the classroom. They still might be following the ideas. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. So there you go, Warren. So some ideas about how to use questioning. I don't know if you've heard or looked at, Warren, but there's also stuff, Kagan has got quite a lot of nice group work activities that make sure that everybody is participating at the same time and has equal responsibility to simultaneously support the group work. But as Chris said, it's about the activity, that these are strategies that might help. So if you Google Kagan, you'll get some ideas on there that will support, as Chris says, your use of going around then and using your questioning to deepen their learning and involve more. Okay, so next we have got Sonia Stocks, and Sonia asks, assessing the success of differentiation is an interesting one. So she can see if the students have improved, which I think is interesting as well, but there are so many different techniques. She's wondering about whether or not she chose the appropriate one. How would she know?
Yeah, well, I think you've got the key to what you want to do, and that is to be checking on have individuals improved. That's really where assessment should be focused. We talk about assessment being ipsative. This means getting children to compare themselves with their previous performance. So, am I getting better at being systematic in the way that I work in science? Or am I getting better at checking for errors when I open up the brackets in an equation? It's those sorts of things that really we need to focus on, and students should be aware of that. So anything that helps you and the student look at their improvement and their progress is important. Clearly, occasionally, parents, head teachers, maybe inspectors want us to look across the class and compare one student's performance with another. There's loads of tests around for that. Just use tests for that sort of thing, because that's just a check every now and again. Whereas when you're looking at improvement, that's when you go into that more detailed information about their learning that will help you plan what you're going to do next. That's the formative part of it. And do the occasional summative just to satisfy those who want that accountability issue dealt with.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Sonia. So moving on, we have a question from Judy Sarah. Judy is saying, and she teaches lots of different groups with different students that she sees twice a week. Her question is, do we have any ideas about how you keep track of each learner's journey? And I think this is sometimes where we end up with the tail that wags the dog and teachers spending hours keeping track of it, whereas you're saying the important thing is the progress in the learning.
Yeah.
So have you got any top tips for that or any thoughts for Judy?
Well, having recently been at an Association for Science Education conference and seen some of my primary colleagues explaining how they're keeping track of how students are doing, performing on the national curriculum, now that we've moved into a new system of assessment in England, assessment without levels. What they're saying is that you just record students who are not quite there. So you just accept that if you've got a register or you've got a mark book, electronic or on paper, that the students have got there, unless you've actually recorded something about what they need to do in order to get there. So you're just recording really what you need to work on with the students. This is the critical part of it. And then you might have the occasional student who does something phenomenal and exceptional. You might want to record that as well, because it might be nice So you can remember to put it on their school report or tell their parents at the school gate or whatever it is that's there. But it's whatever you need for that sort of thing. And when you just look back at that over a couple of days, if you're a primary teacher or if you're a secondary teacher over a couple of weeks, and see on the occasions you've met students, there's information about individuals, and then if there's somebody that you particularly feel you've not noticed, then that's who you look at the next lesson and collect data on that. And gradually building it up in a sort of more piecemeal jigsaw way like that, you start to build a picture of the whole class as well as catering for those individual needs, which is what you're trying to do as a teacher.
That's great, thank you. So thank you, Judy. It's definitely something I think a lot of teachers spend a lot of time thinking about. For me, I've been thinking about it recently, and I think it's less tracking and it's more mapping.
Yeah.
It's what can they or can't they do, which is what Chris is saying.
Yeah.
And actually thinking about how you respond to that over time and help support them.
And that fits in with what your expectations are. You know, what would you expect a 13-year-old to be able to do if they're doing, say, a Hooke's Law experiment? You know, should they be able to actually draw the scale on the graph themselves? Should they be able to measure an extension, or will they need help with that? You make your decisions about where you'd expect a 13-year-old to be, and then you can record those who are not quite there yet and what help they need to get there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Okay, thank you, Judy. Moving on to a question from Anne Wuth. Anne asks, because she works in a rural area. She talks about being a recently qualified primary teacher, but Anne, I don't think you're on your own with this one. I think she's talking about classes where she's got multi-age children in there in a remote and rural area. How does that work when you've got such a wide age range of children that you're teaching?
Yeah, I mean, hats off to these teachers. I've seen some in some areas of Scotland and some areas of Wales who've got these small multi-age classrooms. And really what I see them doing is they might be doing similar topics, but the teachers have already worked out very carefully what they'd expect from the 9-year-old compared to the 7-year-old. And so there's sort of different outcomes for those different ages. But at the same time, they can support one another because they're at different stages in their own cognitive development, in their own experience of working with others. So you sometimes get some mini teachers of the older children with the younger children. And, you know, using those sorts of activities in the classroom that engage different age groups can help with that. I certainly think that those sorts of teachers really know their kids well, partly because they're small numbers in the classroom, but also because they actually see them not just through their own eyes as teachers, but through the eyes of the other children. And it's quite interesting the different sort of ideas you get about children's competence when you see them being prompted or scaffolded actually by, say, somebody who's just a year or two older. As to what they can do, because the language that they use with one another is actually sometimes far better at prompting ideas than what we do as teachers, even if we try and get our language level down to student level. So make the most of what you've got, and you know, let us know things that work, because what works in your classroom, even though it's a very different context to many other teachers' classrooms, can help us see different ways of working.
Absolutely. Some of the reading I've been doing around differentiating was talking about education in the past used to be classrooms of children's of lots of different ages, primary and secondary. But as schools have got bigger, we've become less empowered to differentiate and start treating our students as homogenous groups.
Yeah.
So as Chris says, as somebody who's working in a school like that, you're going to develop some amazing differentiating skills. Do share them with us as you're doing that, and relish that challenge, because you'll get to know your learners really well and move them forward. And it's something that those of us who are teaching students who are the same age in a class together actually lose those skills of. So it's part of a learning journey for you, being a recently qualified.
I think also music teachers are very good at this, and musicians in general. You know, you often find, I mean, my daughter used to play in an orchestra, and you would often find, even when she was only 11, she'd be playing alongside students who were 18, 16 or so on. And just the way that they treat one another and help move one another along, and, you know, can actually work together, really shows what can be done in a mixed age group session. And the sort of teachers or conductors who run those sorts of sessions as musicians have got a very, very good way of helping them to collaborate, and maybe we can learn from that as well.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that question, Anne. Moving on, Rebecca asks, she'd like to know, we were talking about early years actually, Rebecca, she'd like to know more about this way of working in early years, successful examples, videos, blogs, etc.
Oh, I'm not a specialist in early years. I've got colleagues that are. I mean, if you're in England, people like Esme Glower at the Institute of Education, or Sally Howard, who's at Oxford Brookes University. I'm sure there's lots of other experts with early years that are around. But early years, well, we all say, and it's true, most teachers of early years are very, very good at differentiating. They look at the individual child and they look at the developmental paths, and on a day-to-day basis, not just the teacher, but all the adults who deal with that children, TAs onwards, actually are recognising what the child's doing as it's moving forward with its learning, and noting that, and they have big discussions about it. I mean, you just need to go and watch. I'm sure there are somewhere you live some good primary early years teachers, because they just really can do differentiation so great, and you'll pick up lots of ideas from just talking to them. But I'm sure there are lots of things on the net, or if not, find somebody that's an early years specialist like Esme or Sally that I said, and they can direct you towards the books and videos you need to look at.
Absolutely, and I'm sure the National STEM Learning Centre run an early years course. I'm sure there's the CPD providers out there who run courses. I have to say, Paul Guinness, who wrote the Teacher's Toolkit, I was lucky enough to get to know and meet before he sadly passed on. He used to say that when he wanted some personal professional development on differentiation, if he wanted to think about it and refresh himself, he would go and watch early years. Yeah. It really is an amazing place to go. And just as Chris says, observe those teachers, how they use the children as learning resources for each other, how they use the other adults, how they use the activities. It's a fantastic way to go and refresh yourself.
How they model what they expect from the kids. And then the kids can actually tell you what it is that they need to do to move forward. It's quite amazing, actually, in an early years classroom.
It is. So thank you very much for that question. Moving on to Claire Thomas, who says, stupid question alert. We don't. All questions are valid, Claire. Thank you very much. I'm going to try and distill this down. So she's talking about in a perfect DFL classroom, should she be thinking across in a lesson or a series of lessons, should she be thinking along the lines in terms of the learning of all, most or some, or how does she differentiate to support the students to move on, or does she just accept at some points that some of the students are not going to get it?
What you've got to do is make sure that all students can access in. So there'll be some activities that all students can do. So the all I don't mind. It's the some and whatever the other one is that I do mind. So all will be able to do the main activities, those main building blocks that we've talked about in science or in technology or in mathematics. It might be that they don't actually remember as much as others. It might be that they don't get as far as one another's at developing some particular skill. But if you were to pick up this same or a similar piece of learning or the next piece of learning that was related to that one, your students should be able to access in and connect with what you've been doing over the last few lessons. So that's what you need to look for. You're trying to build up for them a picture and understanding of how science or mathematics or technology plays out for that topic and how it relates to their next pieces of learning. If they can do that, that's good enough. All right, we're not saying that all children will learn everything the same and be at the same point at the same time. All right, they will do it differently. But what you've got to accept is that they're all capable of actually having a go at things, of actually improving. And that's what you're working on in the differentiated classroom.
Yeah, thank you. And I know that because I've listened to some of Dylan's responses, and he was asked a very similar question by somebody else there, Claire, and Dylan was saying that, as Chris has said, they're all working towards the same learning intention. However, you may differentiate your success criteria. As Chris said, they may get to different points, but actually they all do that learning intention. And that's what, again, we were modelling with our PACE lesson in particular. I'm just thinking all the students were doubling, but they, some were practicing because they hadn't fully understood it. Some were then applying. Some were correcting the teacher so they could actually spot patterns. And then others were doing an extended project. They were all doing the same learning intention, but not necessarily the same activity. So I hope that answers that for you, Claire. Thank you very much. Now looking at Emma Sarker's question. She's talking about differentiation and scaffolding. She said that she used to think that they were synonymous with each other, but she started to dawn on her that they're different strategies. What is the difference between scaffolding and differentiation?
Well, you've picked on one of my favourite things to talk about, Emma. I've just been writing about this because I think scaffolding is one of the most misused of all the terms that you hear teachers say. Teachers are always telling me they're scaffold, and I always ask them, so what have you done and what effect has it had? Because scaffolding is very much about helping students to really examine and to perhaps really reshape their emerging ideas. So you scaffold once students start talking about their understanding of something. And you do this in order that they can then enter into conversation with other students and compare their emerging ideas with the emerging ideas of other students to help develop and take that idea forward. They wouldn't be able to do this unless you were there with the prompts and probes, probably, that's pushing them forward to do that. Because that then takes forward not just their learning, but the learning of other students. What you've got to be able to do is decide on the point when you start dismantling your scaffolding. It's somebody called P in 2004 wrote about fading. This is when you start removing the parts of the scaffold so they can start to do this, keep that understanding and move that understanding forward without you doing those prompts and probes. So it's a very skilled type of work from a teacher. Sometimes teachers get it wrong and they give hints and clues towards the correct answer. That's not what you're doing with scaffolding. All right, that's really, you're shortcutting and preventing those learners going through that difficult mire they need to go through in order to realise which of their ideas are incorrect and which of their ideas are really taking them forward and helping them connect things in science, in mathematics and technology. So, getting scaffolding right it is hard to do. So thank you for asking that one, because it's one that I'm really keen on trying to clear up for teachers. I mean, the great thing about it is that you end up with students who've got ownership of their learning. Whereas if you don't scaffold properly and you just tell them the answer, they just try and remember it, just try and recall it. And recall's not a very effective method of taking learning forward. If they can construct their understanding because you've scaffolding, they take that forward into the next bit of learning, they've got ownership and they move on. All right. If they're doing memory, then they're always going to be chasing you as a teacher, and eventually you want them to learn without you being there.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And that links again.
It's a long one, sorry.
No, that's good. I like him. Can tell.
My passionate ones.
Yeah. It links very much to what Dylan has said in a couple of his responses as well about the metacognition, that we don't always teach our learners how they learn.
Yeah.
I know my PhD thesis, I'm asking students, how do you know you've learned something today? The more honest answer I get more often than not is I don't know.
Yeah.
They say they don't know. And if they are, as Chris says, they're just saying, because I can remember it, if somebody asks me, I can tell them it again.
Yeah.
But they don't understand that that's not learning. It's
Can they recognise that they've learned something, and then can they talk about it with somebody else? So it's not just that I've learned forces. What have you learnt about force? Can you talk to somebody else about it? And then, can you start thinking about what was easy and what was difficult in doing that, so mapping the strategies and the ideas as they were going through, and then eventually looking at, and so how is this helping me learn, looking in a broader sense at it. All four of those ways of doing it are really what you need in the classroom. And I know there's not a lot of time in the classroom to do that, teachers, but if you can get through some of those some of the time, you're going to help your students learn better.
Absolutely, and as Chris said, ultimately be able to help themselves.
Yeah.
So when they do get to a stage in education where they step up, in England it's up to at 16, where they step up to A level, and there's a lot more responsibility on themselves to learn. They will have those strategies within themselves to be successful. My children are at an age where I see lots of their friends dropping out of education because they just don't know how to help themselves get unstuck.
Yeah.
And that's what we really want them to be.
Yeah.
These lifelong learners.
When they go into university at age 18 in England, you get a dropout again, and that's because they've not got teachers behind them. And it's because they've not learnt those learning skills. So you must help them with their learning skills, as well as teach them topics.
So scaffolding, it's needed.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Emma. That was a great one. So Theresa Screm, here we've got a long question.
Yeah.
I think what's at the hub of Theresa's question is it. She's starting to get some clarity of what differentiation is, and she's starting to believe in herself that she can do it from doing the course. That's fantastic, Theresa. But she was just asking a question, is she right in saying that all learners should be trying to achieve the same learning objective, and is the learning objective the same as the learning intention? I'm laughing.
Yeah, I think Andrew answered this one earlier. I mean, they need the same learning intention. The learning objective, yeah, I mean, the learning objective will include possibly the way they go about it, and they may go about it differently with differentiation. So that's a sort of possible yes, but certainly the learning intention should be the same. We want them all to be able to, construct graphs using a table of simple data. So yeah, that working on that, but you might actually have different types of data as they get better at it for some of them, and others will just be practicing similar things. You might, for some of those, be helping them draw the scale if the scale is difficult on a graph. There's different ways through to actually do that, but what you're hoping is they're all achieving something similar in terms of taking their learning forward. So they're actually getting through the curriculum, they're dealing with the skills, they're starting to access the concepts, and they're starting to develop their understanding of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So thank you, Theresa. Theresa asked at the end of her question, what was the learning objective on the board at the start of the bonding lesson or the Sankey diagram lesson? How was it worded? In all honesty, Theresa, I cannot remember, but I am going to ask Paul as our host to make a note of that question. And as we go through to our second version, we could maybe add that information in for future teachers. So thank you for raising that for us. We will look at that in the future. Okay, so moving on to Jesme and Ibekwe. This question here is about the Quadrant tool that we used, and they're asking, how does the teacher handle 4 different activities going on in the classroom at the same time, which is similar to the question we had earlier about how do I cope with it when I'm the only one in the room.
I think you probably, if you know your kids well, will know that where quite a number of them are likely to be starting. So will they be starting on the P, the practice, or will they be starting on the correction or whatever? So you might be able to anticipate in advance. And so you have things ready just to hand to them and they can actually get on with it. Sometimes thinking about where you seat your kids, I'm not saying change it for that lesson, but maybe building up to that lesson, you're thinking about which groups are likely to be good at working together and students that are good at working together. And so that actually gets settled quite quickly. And then those students who need that extra bit from you to chivvy them to get going or to help them access in to get going, you've got time to deal with that. So it's just the normal sort of planning for good teaching that you normally have to do. You're always multitasking as a teacher. But one of the things that you can do once they get going with the activities is you can step back and just survey and have a look at how they're all doing. And don't just go in and intervene quickly. Sometimes we all make that mistake as teachers and think, oh, I've got to be busy, I've got to go and help this group. Sometimes they can just be getting on with it, and you just have a good look at how they're getting on with it, look over their shoulders to see how they're doing, and maybe even if they're making a few mistakes or not doing it quite as you'd want them to, thinking for a little while about how you might take that forward, because it might be you want to work with that individual to take it forward, or you might notice several students making similar errors, and so you either do that by drawing that group together, or maybe even by putting it up on the board and getting others in the group to actually help those particular students to move forward. Yeah, so it's being strategic, but giving yourself time to plan, because that's one of the most important things to do as a teacher. Don't rush in. Try and find some time to do some thinking and some planning as well. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jesme, thank you for that question. So we're coming to the end then of the questions that we've had submitted that we've had the opportunity to look at. For those of you who've submitted questions that we've not had an opportunity to respond to, we've still got another 10 days of the course to go, so we will be looking at those questions within the content of the course and trying to respond to those as well, just to make sure that everybody feels that their questions have been addressed. So don't worry if we've not managed to pick it up today in the question and answer, but thank you very much for your questions. Again, this is kind of like my little thing at the end, is just I think there's been some themes coming out. I think the key thing for me from what Chris has been saying and also what Dylan has been saying is that as teachers, we are the key agent in that classroom for getting every student to make progress. And it's how we draw on our skills and how, as Chris says, we plan for the learning and plan for our learners that is going to make that biggest impact and difference. So it's about knowing your students, it's about increasing their ownership over time for their learning, but also for understanding about how they learn and go about learning and building that for them, and then responding to that and tailoring what we do for the students, building that classroom culture where they're going to choose the challenge because they know that they learn, giving them that guidance, and then thinking about how we're using the assessment information that we're getting, the evidence that we're eliciting, so that we actually respond to it. And Chris's idea that you don't have to record everything, but you need to record where the significant points are for you as a teacher, where you need to then take action and use your time and your planning to make a difference. And so, you know, it's that assessment for learning is at the heart of this, that you can't differentiate effectively unless you're using formative practices well, and that it's going to take time. I think that's come out. It's going to take time. It's going to take critical reflection from us as professionals, thinking about our practice and what we're doing, and then that we'll respond and think about that when we're planning. So the time is that reflecting and planning so that we can make the biggest difference for those students in that classroom, and so that they all make progress. Not necessarily the same progress, but they all make progress and understanding. Okay, so thank you very much, Chris.
Great summary.
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of this. I know that the online course will get so much out of the threads when you're reflecting with each other. You get so much out of the videos of Chris and Dylan, so much out of seeing our teachers who are amazing, practice ideas in the classroom. But it's really good to be able to have this Q&A session because it gives us a chance to respond, not quite live, but not far off in terms of the questions that you're raising as we go through. So we really do appreciate you submitting these, and for Chris and Dylan's time. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy listening.
Okay, bye. Keep differentiating.
Yeah, keep practicing.